Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and I am excited to finally round up the Warcry meta here in autumn of 2024. It has been a while since I've done this. Now we have a lot of data to tell you what people are playing, what is winning, and all of that good stuff. So first, I'm going to before I get into faction win rates, I just want to talk about the shape of the meta right now and what people are playing. Something after the meta watch that happened is that model counts in warbands reduced a little bit. The biggest thing you'll see a reduction of is there used to be a lot of 12 and 11 model lists, and now that is just much, much rarer. Only 15 people have brought 11 or 12 models to a tournament. And so you're seeing a lot more sort of 6 and 7 model lists. Now, 8 and 9 are still the most popular. They probably always will be because that's what bespokes come in. And 8 does seem to be a bit of a sweet spot. People bringing 8 fighters tend to be doing pretty well. And the reason I don't think you should read too much into it is because a lot of these win rates, I think, are a reflection of the factions that tend to bounce into these buckets. And some of those factions just have a little bit more trouble than others, but I will say that it does seem to be a little bit more difficult to win with 5 or 6, and it does seem to be pretty promising. Looking at 10 models, 11 models, people doing that seem to be doing pretty well. People who have brought 15 fighters are currently undefeated, which is pretty funny, but I will say that both of those performances, while impressive, every win is awesome, well done. One of these is I-10 from Off Meta Musings, but while every win is impressive, both of those you should note are from packs that didn't really require you to really kill much of anything. And so like there were no missions in those packs where you could get a point for killing. So I do think running more models, a lot of people I think right now around the community are sort of wondering why people aren't running more swarms and getting excited about swarms. And I will just note, there's definitely a lot here. There's smoke, so it's up to you to decide if there's fire, but just make sure that you scout the pack first before you decide that you really want to go all swarm, because you'll want to make sure that it's a pack that's friendly to that and that doesn't just give your opponent free points just for killing your little guys. If you look at the sort of second spreadsheet I've got here, Vulcan Flameseekers is the most popular warband in the game. I do think that they are the best designed warband in the game. They're not the strongest or even close, really, but they, I think, have the best design, the most tricks, the most, like, they're somehow both a little bit forgiving for small mistakes while also just being very tricksy at the same time. So you can, like, flex your creativity without getting punished that much for just like little mistakes in fundamentals, which I think is really cool and a really amazing design. But Soulblight are still really popular and can still bring a lot of numbers, but generally outside of that, the nerfing of a lot of the good chaff in the game, nerfing OBR's chaff, nerfing Soulblight's sort of cheapest chaff, nerfing Nurgle and KO's chaff, horns as well, has really lowered numbers quite a bit. Again, you don't want to overstate the case because people are still bringing a lot of bespokes in that 8 or 9 range, but it is definitely noticeable. I also think it's really interesting that 2 of the 5 most popular factions in the game have been reworked. So Ironjaws and Slaves to Darkness were, the gap between those and the next most popular group of Seraphon, Wildercore, and Iron Golems is quite a bit, and it's kind of interesting how that kind of plays out. I don't know. I've learned a long time ago that I don't know what cool is. So what people find cool is always a mystery to me, but people have seemed to really latch on to those 2 factions, partly for power level reasons, as I'll get into in a minute, but it is interesting how those have been reworked now, and so you might see a bit of a different shape of the meta. I don't know if Ironjaws fans will stick with Ironjaws, or if Slaves to Darkness fans will all move to Dark Oath, or what, who knows what's going to happen there, but I think that's interesting. So let's get into the actual win rates. And the first thing here, there's a lot of red and yellow on this parfait. And so I want to talk about just a few of the highest ones here and how there's kind of something interesting going on where faction superfans get to play a ton of games with their favorite faction. So for example, Royal Beast Flayers, Slaanesh Sybarites, and Demons of Slaanesh are all kind of just enjoying one or two flag bearers who are just like kicking ass with the faction, and that's sort of what's brought them up so high. So, for example, Demons of Slaanesh are mostly just played by Charlie Bitterlake, and he's crushing with it. He's got this build that he really likes where he's got Vexmore and a Fomoroid Crusher in there, and I think he's got Vastus usually is in there too. He's always running 8, and he goes 3-1 at every tournament he goes to, right? And so how much of that is Charlie being good, and how much of that is Demons of Slaanesh being really good? That's difficult to say from the data. I'll give more editorializing later when I get to the tier list, but from the data, it's very difficult to determine. So that can be true of Royal Beast players and Slaanesh Sybarites, but what is clear is that they are very promising, and I'm very interested to see if other folks in the community can win with those factions as well. One other thing that kind of stratifies everything quite a bit is that I think the wider community isn't necessarily aware right now of how competitive list building is working. So you'll see, for example, Wielder of the Blade or Vexmore in a lot as just like a catch-all in death or a catch-all in chaos. And their win rates kind of suffer from that when both of these pieces are incredibly powerful in some factions and some types of lists, and actually a little bit more middle of the road in other factions and other types of lists. And so you can really misplace these fighters in your warbands. And so I think that is part of what is creating the like really wide spread of win rates here. But also just in general, the gap between a tuned list and a casual list is widening quite a bit. So you'll see, some bespoke issues that I think are worth bringing up in a little bit that can also bring some of those to a pretty low win rate. But the things that I think, if we were going to play contender or pretender here, Ogre Maw Tribes, I think is not a fluke. I think a lot of different players are playing with Ogre Maw Tribes, and a lot of them are doing pretty well. You don't see Ogre Maw Tribes necessarily win a lot of tournaments, but they just generally do quite well. And I think if you tried to really tune them as high as they could go, I think that they would still win a lot of tournaments because Crushers, Gutlords, and Tyrants are just really good leaders, and Noblars are really cheap, and those are just two of the great ingredients to have, right? And so you can play around with a lot there and win a lot there. I also think that depending on where you play, Ogre Maw Tribes will just tear through a bespoke warband. They will absolutely rip through, just like, here's my one box of Untamed Beasts, and Ogre Maw Tribes will just like absolutely tear through that. And so I think depending on where you are in the world, if you're somewhere where a lot of people are playing those types of one box casual warbands, that's where Ogre Maw Tribes will really feast. Dispossessed are kind of the opposite type of playstyle, but I think they are definite real contenders here. They're not that popular other than in the Midwest and Scandinavia, but Dispossessed have the ability Over My Dead Body, which allows you to count for 2 on objectives. They also have an incredible reaction that lets you give an action to one of your fighters when your guys have gone down and died. So Dispossessed is able to kind of combo a little bit to get some damage out there, and then also just pick an objective and win it, which is really impressive, and honestly is one of the things that I would caution you for playing a big swarm. Just think about whether your local meta has a lot of Dispossessed in it, because Dispossessed can kind of counter swarms really easily by just using their ability to make the numbers not matter. Which I think is really interesting. So those are kind of the highest win rates. Iron Jaws, Old Iron Jaws, and Old Slaves to Darkness are in a really interesting place. With the battle trait, Iron Jaws played 56 games. They also played a whole bunch without the battle trait, 50 games without it. But with the battle trait, they were at a 62% win rate. Without it, they were actually below 50%. But with the battle trait, 62% win rate out of 15 players, I believe, who took them to tournaments with the battle trait. 14 of them finished 500 or better. I put out a video a while ago on just like how Ironjawz I thought was underplayed and had a lot of really quality stuff in there, and I wanted to give people a guide on it. And then the battle trait came out a little bit after that video. And in that video, I said that Ironjawz were one of the hardest factions to play. And after the battle trait dropped, I think that completely flipped and they became one of the strongest factions in the game. I think looking at how popular Ironjawz was during that brief period of time, really the only faction I could say could argue to have been a more powerful faction during that time was Slaves to Darkness, because Ironjawz were just winning everything, and everyone who picked them up, literally one person, no shade at that one person, I don't know what happened in that tournament. They might have just had really bad matchups or something, but all but one of the people who picked up Ironjawz finished 500 or better with them, which is just absolutely wild. I mean, that is going back to the most broken eras of the game. They really felt like the strongest faction in the game there, as well as Slaves to Darkness, who with 100 players playing them in a not very long amount of time, just 100 games in, but a lot of people playing them, still managed to have a 60% win rate. And that's when Slaves to Darkness, as a pretty public faction, that's a lot of just here's my box of Chaos Warriors. I'm going to roll them out here and see what happens, right? So Slaves to Darkness were winning a lot of tournaments. Ironjawz were also winning a lot of tournaments. I think that they were really ready to take over in a somewhat oppressive way. And now that probably won't happen. One interesting thing here, I talked about how Ogre Maw tribes just rip through Bespokes. I also put out a video a little bit ago where I was talking about how Divine Blessings can put out a ton of damage. Bespokes in general are very, very vulnerable to big damage because you just have a lot of specialists whose only job is to die, right? You just have a lot of 90 to 150 point fighters in your Bespoke lists who really don't do anything except die. And unfortunately, that's extra true of the last 4 Bespokes they put out. So it's been kind of too bad. I feel like I've seen a few people around the local game store playing these factions, but you don't see them here in the stats because no one's taking them to tournaments, because when you try them out at your local game store, you're just getting crushed. I mean, everyone who's tried them at the LGS has just been really, really disappointed with the performance of these last 4 Bespoke warbands, which is, I think, is why you're not seeing them. And it's a little too bad. I think a lot of what's being played right now kind of soft counters these, and they're not very good to start with. So when you're getting countered and you're not very good, it's a tough spot to be in. And I think it really deserves its own video, because I think we could use a little bit more power creep in Warcry. Now that I've kind of talked about the win rates, I didn't go too in depth on the bottom of the meta, but you can kind of draw your own conclusions there. I wanted to talk about allies, because I think that in most of these games, allies are really, really important and the kind of real secret to what's being played, especially with Underworlds. So, for example, almost every popular ally right now has a positive win rate, which is really interesting, even in a world where half these numbers are in a world with battle traits, but good allies are still doing really well. Now, some of these are just really way too easy to misuse to have sky-high win rates. Like, for example, Calthea is barely above 500. She's just she's thought of as just kind of a plug-and-play fighter, but I don't think she's actually good at that. She really needs her triple to be boosting up high-value fighters, except she also needs to be on a team that has enough fighters in it where you just have all those high-value fighters on the board. She really wants to be in a... She really doesn't want to be in a 6 model team, for example. But then if you have her in an 8 or a 9 model team, sometimes the fighters that you're accelerating with Calthea aren't high impact enough to make that triple actually good. And her stats are pretty blah, right? So I think that that's just really interesting, where she's a really powerful piece, but I think she kind of gets overplayed a little bit to the point where she doesn't really do that well. Errant Quester is another one where it seems like just a plug and play. It's really fun. I think Errant Quester is really fun. But Soulsworn Knight Relictor, for example, is doing much better. And I almost wonder Is that random numbers because only 22 games is not a lot of games? Or is it just that the Soulsworn having that ranged attack just ends up being more useful more of the time than the kind of better um, better melee attack and better melee abilities of the errant quester? I think that's a really interesting sort of debate you can have with yourself. That is really fascinating to me. I personally am not that into the Knight Relictor, but it does have that ranged attack. You can use the double and then shoot something. People, I think, talk about it for the quad. I think the quad can win you a game, but I don't think you should build around quads. And I don't think there's very many situations where that quad would win you the game, where Rampage wouldn't win you the game. But it does exist, but I think people are getting a lot of value out of the ranged attack out of it. There's also more to say about Bladeborn here. There's a few Bladeborn warbands that are doing very, very well in win rate. Again, not with a ton of games played, so this could really, it could be the new key to things, or it could be kind of a red herring. I think it's kind of interesting to think about. But there are three in particular. The one at the very top, Dread Pageant, is based on just Slake Slash being really good in Slaanesh Sybarites. Man, I can never say Slaanesh Mortal's name properly, but it's mostly based on Slake Slash being very good. And Slake Slash did have a 5-point nerf. I don't think that nerf is going to matter much, but I'd want to wait and see a little bit. But the other three that I'm very interested in and that I think are worth talking about, I think kind of merit their own subsection of the video. I think the Exiled Dead are doing really well, which I think is fascinating because the rest of Soulblight is doing very poorly. Soulblight's win rate is down to like 46% or something, but the Exiled Dead are winning like all their games, which is fascinating to me. So what do you get with the Exiled Dead? You get really good efficiency on everything except for Coil and Regulus. Coil's kind of bad. I don't think you should take Coil, but and Regulus I just didn't even put here because I think Regulus is terrible. But everything else is kind of wild. So, for example, Prentice Markov, 70 points, 15 wounds, really good durability. And then just, move 4 is something that is kind of hard to come by for Soulblight Gravelords. All of these guys moving 4. The other 3 only have 10 wounds, which isn't quite as impressive, but they've got just kind of weirdly good attack profiles, being able to crit for 4 for only 60 points and having the 10 wounds and having a pretty relevant ability with crackling arcs. It's all just really good. All of them are allowed to be resurrected, or at least Ion, Bolt, and Vlash are allowed to be resurrected, which again, like they move across the field, they get resurrected, they have access to all the really good abilities. This is definitely the strongest thing in Soulblight Gravelords right now. Daintalos is just good enough that they can be plug and play for any death faction too. So, for example, if you're in Askergan True Blades or Flesh Eater Courts and your chaff models are just either non-existent for Askergan or just kind of disappointing, you can pretty happily bring in the Exiled Dead, play Daintalos, Prentice Markov, Ion, Vault, and Vlash. It's Bolt, not Vault, and Vlash. And you can just have a good time and it'll make your warband a lot better. So I think that there's a lot to like with the Exiled Dead. I even think that Daintalos's strength 6 on the Wizard Blast makes the Wizard Blast a lot more interesting, and these guys are really worth playing. The people who are playing with them are doing really, really well, even though it hasn't been a ton of people. Another group that people have been winning a ton with is Skabbik's Plague Pack. It's pretty interesting here. So the non-Skritter minions in Skabbik's Plague Pack give you a kind of efficiency that you traditionally can't really get at move 6. So, for example, 12 wounds on the cheaper ones, the 90-point ones, makes them a lot harder to kill, but then they still have pretty reasonable attack profiles, either with the range 2 and 3315 or just 4314. Means that normally things that fast, you just can't deal that much damage and be that durable and still be vaguely cheap. And then Rubidius and Itchit also just have like a lot of interesting play to them. Rubidius being 14 wounds instead of 12 is also pretty interesting, like against 3/6 profiles, things like that, even against 4/8 profiles, which are becoming some of the more popular things in the game. So that's, I think, a really interesting sort of place to be and a really powerful place to be. But then where you get extra fun is Befoul the Land and Unctuous Citations. Unctuous Citations is just 2 actions, but you can actually use them to have both of them on Skabic, or you can have like Skabic gets an action and Rabidius gets an action. It's an incredibly flexible action triple. And then Befoul the Land just against sort of swarms or against like one treasure or like one objective in the middle of the battlefield. Befoul the Land can get a lot of damage out there, which is pretty good. So Skabic's Plague Pack just gives you a whole bunch of different options, and people are winning with it. I do wonder if part of it is because people are really winning with Skaven, Skaven being in that mid-50s win rate. But Skabic's Plague Pack have a much better win rate than regular Skaven does. And I think part of it is that you can just do so much with it. You can add speed to a slow faction. So like you can put the Plague Pack in with Nurgle Rotbringers. Someone did that and did pretty well. You can also add dice value to a vanilla warband. So for example, Slaanesh Demons, Khorne Mortals, Iron Golems, none of them have any good dice abilities. And so you can bring the Plague Pack in to sort of just give them a lot more to do with their dice. And that can actually give you a lot of value that you wouldn't have otherwise. And also, like, Iron Golems can be pretty slow as well, so you're kind of getting both of those values there. They also can kind of add some secondary threats to like a Smalls and Talls faction. So for example, in Skaven, it can be kind of nice to bring a couple of these to have something in between your Rat Ogres and your Clan Rats that can be kind of powerful. And so there's just a lot you can do with Skabic's Plague Pack. I think they're easy to misplay. I think you could, if they were much more public, I don't think the win rate would be as high, but they are very powerful in the hands of someone who's kind of practiced with them a little bit. And that's something to get excited about. The final ally that I think not a lot of people know about that is really crushing it right now is the Scar Veteran on Cold One. Again, this is one that the win rate is just very impressive, 73%. Yes, it's only 21 games. It's not a lot of play yet, but man, the early returns are incredibly promising on the Scar Veteran. You probably want to use a strength buff to have 4/5, 2/4. But then what it does is it becomes this mobile platform 7-inch move for Tearing Bite, which is one of the best damage triples out there. And it's a very durable platform too, so it's very hard to kill the Scar Veteran, and then it can just run over and do just like a silly amount of damage. And so it can just like one-shot kill things that are worth 150 points, almost 200 points sometimes, and be just like a really great plan B for just like this assassin who you just add a triple to it and it just goes and kills something while the rest of your warband does whatever the rest of your warband wants to do. And I think that's a really powerful place to be. It's a thing that you just don't have to think much about as long as you're willing to commit a triple to it. So it's really good in warbands that don't really use dice much, which is really great. Any kind of list that is powerful but lacks bite, can't wait to have a Sora Scar Veteran on Cold One. I think more people should play this. Not in every list. For example, I think any list that has a lot of offense already, any Stormcast list, I don't think you want this guy in Stormcast, things like that. But anything like, I know not a lot of people play Fire Slayers, but he's like the perfect thing to put into Fire Slayers. I think he's perfect in Dispossessed. I think there's a lot of places to use this guy to get a ton of value at 235 points. So with all that said, here is my current tier list at the moment in autumn of 2024. There are a few things to talk about before I get into these specific tiers. I will spend a whole bunch of time on each individual subset here of factions. But the first thing is, if you had me do this video 1 month ago before the last FAQ, I would have had Iron Jaws and Slaves to Darkness as number 1 and 2. I don't think it was very close. I think those two were head and shoulders ahead of everything else. There's a couple factions I probably would have slid in there with them at S tier, but I think those are we're in a really crazy place. And so I was glad that they got reworked. Whether you're one of the folks who thinks that Ironjaw's got a secret buff or not, you be you. I love you guys. But personally, I just felt like those two factions were just so far ahead of everything else. As is, I think we have a much more sort of balanced tier list, although I'm still creating an S tier. I'm calling it sorta S because I don't think the difference between that and some of the other factions is necessarily that crazy. I also had kind of an interesting decision to make about what to do if you're a faction like, say, Idneth Deepkin, who have an amazing Underworlds team, but are otherwise kind of garbage. Um, like Demons of Zinch is like this too. They have a really awesome Underworlds team. But at the end of the day, I kind of went on whether or not your Underworlds team does its best work in your faction or in other factions. So, for example, Cyrene and Sephanir are the two really good Underworlds fighters in Idneth Deepkin. They're just way better in Vulcan Flameseekers than they are in Idneth Deepkin, so it's just hard to give Idneth the credit for them. As opposed to, say, Mollog, who is incredible in Gloomspite Gitz. I think I've played 2 games with Mollog now, and I've played 1 game against Mollog, and I've been very impressed every single time. I think Mollog is so good. But I think that, I'm not convinced by Mollog as an ally so much. I think he's got some like pretty special things that he's doing just in Gloomspite Gitz, which I think is good. His kind of control play style, I think, is solid with their battle trait, stuff like that. So I think that I'm inclined to give Gloomspite the credit for Mollog in a way I'm not inclined to give IDK. That might be hypocritical. I can definitely see arguments either way, but that's where I landed on it. Another issue is like if you had sort of odd win rates compared to like my mind, like for example Jade Obelisk has the lowest win rate in the game, but like I think they're a lot better than that. You know Soulblight Gravelords is another one with a really low win rate, but I don't think it's necessarily that bad. Demons of Slanesh have a really high win rate, but I have them a little bit lower because it's what I said before about them mostly being one player. So that's kind of a little bit of the stuff that kind of went into this on a broad strokes level. And now I'm going to get into each individual group. Let's get into the very tippity top. I think Skaven right now are the best faction in the game. I do think it's close. I think that everything in S is really close. And I will admit that I don't think very many people in the community agree with me. Skaven is a little bit theoretical here, but essentially what I'm going for is they already had a 58% win rate. People were already winning a ton when they brought Skaven, and they got massive buffs. The battle trait is ridiculous for them, and also they have new Rat Ogres, which have really good abilities. I think the previous Rat Ogre, you could argue whether the profile was better before or better now. You could go back and forth all day over that, but the double to just get a free attack on its own without needing weird sequencing from a Packmaster is incredibly powerful. And then the battle trait is just absolutely nuts. I am currently in a TTS league. I think I don't really like TTS as a program, if I'm being honest, but I wanted to join TTS League because I just saw how much TTS regulars, people playing online, Warcry basically, TTS regulars were just dominating all the in real life tournaments they were playing. And so I began to feel like you really need to go on there and play in those competitive tournaments to get a sense for sort of how the best players think and what is going on. Not saying that you can't be good at Warcry if you don't play TTS. There's a ton of people who are really good at Warcry who don't play TTS, but it is like the best place to just get a sort of sense of what really plugged in players are playing and what they're thinking about their games. And in the current TTS league, there is going to be an all Skaven finals because, I brought Skaven, Andy Morris brought Skaven, and the two of us are going to meet in the finals. And both of us have been saying that we feel like we've been kind of misplaying a lot and that we didn't really get it right with how we built our Skaven lists. Like, I'm not going to put my Skaven list up on the screen here because I just don't think I got it right. And yet we're still winning all our games because, well, we both have a draw, but we're both at 2 wins and a draw in a league of, like the most competitive league that there is right now, which is TTS League. And I think it's just because Skaven might be busted. I really feel like in my 3 games, I was pretty severely outplayed in 2 of them, and I still won one of them and got a draw in the other one. I think Skaven is insane right now. So that's where I'm at. I know I don't necessarily have the data to prove it yet because, 58% win rate is very good, but it's not like broken. But my hunch right now is that Skaven are broken. And that, as people get better with them, they might get even better. I think it's possible that Skaven's win rate will never go into like the crazy like high 60s because they're really hard to play. I'm the reason I'm getting outplayed every game is because I'm just like really struggling with my decisions with Skaven. I've never had a warband. I was telling people Iron Jaws were hard to play, but I was always very confident about my decisions with them. I've never had a warband where I felt like I was wrong immediately after making a play as often as I'm having with Skaven, which is wild. So they're really hard to play, but I think once you get practice with them, I think you're going to win a lot, like a lot. If you play with the battle trait and you play with the new rat ogres, honestly, if you play with the old storm fiends, I still think you're going to win a lot. So I think Skaven might just be crazy right now. The next sort of group in the top here is Vexmore homes. So Vexmore has kind of been talked about as the number one thing in the meta. When I showed the various allies that are getting played, Vexmore had a very impressive showing in that Vexmore and company, the Thriceful Discord, are at a 61% win rate despite being taken by a million different players, but having 178 games played. They're still an incredibly high win rate. If it weren't for Iron Golems, that's mean. But like there's a few Chaos factions that are like really dropping Vex's win rate where you just put Vex into a terrible faction. But having the best Vexmore home, I think, is a legitimate way to win a ton of games right now. And you can have terrifying lists with Vexmore in Slaanesh Sybarites and still have 10 models, which is crazy. You can have a ton of hitting power and still have 9 models. Beasts of Chaos also complement Vexmore really well. Gores do exactly what Vexmore doesn't do. A Doombull is fast enough to get to places. So are Bloodkinds. They're both fast enough to get to places early that Vex can't get to. I'm especially excited about them because you get that free move in turn 1. And so you can just fly across the board, get a kill really early, and then be way up on activations with Beasts of Chaos. So I think Slaanesh Sybarites just has a bigger body of work. I think that 55 points on Homunculi is wild. I think that Slake Slash, even though it got a 5-point nerf, you could have gone higher with that. I think Slake Slash is ridiculous. So I am putting Slaanesh Sybarites as the number 2 in the game right now in S tier. But watch out for Beasts of Chaos. They're really solid too as far as Vexmore homes. The next kind of group we have in these top tiers are like, what is the best destruction soup home? And I really think right now, Ogre Maw tribes, they're winning a ton, whether they're S tier because they're pub stomping or whether they're S tier because you can really win tournaments with them is a question. And I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt because their win rate is so ridiculous. But you could argue they should go down to A because you could argue they're more of a pub stomp team. That they can have a little bit of a tough time against other really busted warbands, but I think they're incredibly impressive, and I think if you really put effort into tuning them, I think you can go crazy because Noblars are so cheap, and you still have a lot of Underworlds chaff that are undercosted. There's the 140-point Noblar, there's Lugget and Thwack, which are really good at 65 points. There's just a ton of options once you sort of collect all the little Pokemon in Underworld's warbands. So they also just have the most hitting power. And in a world where people are playing smaller lists, being able to go over the top and have more hitting power than your opponent is really scary. You can do things with Ogre Maw tribes, like you can play 8 or 9 fighters and still have more offense than the 6 fighter list you're going up against. And that's a disaster for your opponent. So ogres are really crazy, but Cruel Boys and Cruel Boys Monster Killers are both really amazing too. So Monster Killers, you can kind of do this really cool reaction control thing that I don't think is as busted as Dispossess reaction control, but it's still really good. And then in Cruel Boys, you just have you get Shank, who is the best netter in the game, and you also get just really durable gut rippers, which are really great. And then your leader choices are not the most impressive, but Bolt Boy Boss and a Strength Blessed Killer Boss, I think, are good enough that they don't feel like taxes. They do feel pretty powerful. And just the gut rippers being hard to kill, it just really puts them over the top. There's some really crazy Cruel Boy stuff you can see, and Cruel Boy's been doing really well, even though they're really popular, which is something I value a lot. Monster Killers, you can get some really crazy stuff as far as just your little abilities, and they're one of those bespokes where the specialists are actually good, which is really rare, right? And so, like, you're basically like a shooting warband and a reaction control warband and a smashy warband all at the same time. So I would say they're the most versatile warband in the game. They're not number one most powerful, but they are the most versatile, and that's incredibly powerful and enough to put them at the top of A tier for me. Finally, Dispossessed and Wildercore aren't very similar to each other, but we do need to talk about the two order warbands in S. Dispossessed just will like destroy you on objectives. They have the double that wins an objective. They have the reaction that gives their friend a win. The one thing about Dispossessed, I was looking through, only one person has actually won a tournament with Dispossessed. In general, they're just going 3-1 every time, which is really good. But it does mean, I think, if you want to win a tournament, you have to bet that you're going to win the objective missions, and then you have to go and figure out how to cheese the non-objective missions that are at the tournament you're going to go into. You need to figure out exactly which piece is going to win those games and then go win those games. I think it's very challenging to build a 4-0 Dispossessed list right now, but it's very easy to build a 3-1-1. And it's not easy, but it's very possible. And so the little bit of extra that's in there is just figuring out how you're going to get that one last win on a not objective mission. The last S tier one is Wildercore. Wildercore, I kind of see them as a scarier Hunters of Huanchi. I think reasonable people could disagree and want to flip them, but I think that Wildercore are just really scary right now with what crossbows can do. And the other thing that kind of bumps them up over Hunters of Huanchi, they're two very, very similar factions, but Wildercore have other builds that are also very good. So, for example, and these would all be kind of B tier builds, but for example, like the all doggy build is pretty reasonable. The Arbalester kind of combo build with the battle trait is pretty good now too. So there's like a lot that Wildercore can do. Just know that one box Wildercore is not very good at all, and so Wildercore's overall win rate is never going to be that crazy, because when you just get one box of them, it's really bad because you're like stuck between these 3 different play styles and you're not like good at any of them. But when you really specialize and you go all crossbows or all dogs or 2 big crossbows, that's when Wildercore gets really, really crazy and really, really good. You can just like pick apart so many different warbands. You can stay alive so easily. I think they're incredibly powerful and absolutely worth being afraid of in any tournament you go to. The only other warband I haven't talked about, I won't talk about every warband in the other tiers, but Royal Beast Flayers, there's sort of one build where you just have a ton of ghouls, 2 barons, a wielder of the blade, and then your leader. And then you can just like abuse the weight mechanic to then get your weights, turn your weights into move actions with the barons. So you can basically force your opponent to completely activate out, and then you can play your entire turn all at once, which is kind of what you need when your damage output is generally going to be based on like pack tactics, which is their kind of swarm damage ability, or just having your wielder of the blade or your leader just like fight something, but they're like not very sturdy, so they can easily lose fights to big things. So when you force your opponent to move everything, and then you get to go pick a fight with your wielder or pick a fight with your leader where they won't just get blown up as soon as they're done fighting, that's when it's really powerful. We'll see if I remember to edit that part. But so that's when it's really powerful. And I'm really curious to see if other people can sort of replicate that success. I do think it's possible, as long as you know, like, as long as you have hints for where to start. Basically, wait a ton, then convert your waits into real actions. You'll need to practice a little bit, but I would like to see other people try it out because they're really good. People have proven that they're really good. But so far only two people have proven that, and they're people who tend to win a lot even when they play other factions too. So I'm giving Royal Beast Flayers the respect right now of putting them in A, but I don't know exactly where I would go other than that. And finally, before I move on to the lower tiers, I'm happy to spend more time on the top one. One of the things that unites everything in S tier here, above A as well, is that all of them, I think, really have the tools to pull apart both elite, mid-range, and swarm opponents. So, for example, ogres and cruel boys, you might think of these as like pretty small warbands, although both have a pretty easy time counting to 9 models. And then they have an easy time doing it while bringing in either Morgok, who is the new Underworlds brute boss who got a nice little points drop recently, or just a regular brute boss. And so that brute boss can go Umessen to take an objective from a swarm list. They can also, just like ogres, get those doubles to just like kill something and then get a free action to kill again. So to cruel boys, if they just bring in an ogre ally, it's really easy for them to do so. Destruction just has a lot of sort of ease of play like that. But then you also look at, for example, cruel boys has Shank, who can net you. So that your super elite list just struggles to gain any traction against them. Ogres have the fact that they just kind of go over the top of you, so even if you're really elite, they just smash even harder. Dispossessed, for example, have the ability to play this waiting game, and then they can either overcount the numbers of a swarm list. So, for example, a dispossessed list that is playing 9 models, they only have to kill like 2 fighters from a really swarmy swarm list before all of a sudden Over My Dead Body just counts as if they had more numbers than the swarm. But then against an elite list, they can just put dwarves in your face, and you either kill the dwarf or you don't do anything. And then their 1 or 2 elites that they have in their faction get to just like do double the work of your elites and just kind of rev the engines and just go faster than you, which can be really frustrating. All of these have things they can do with that. Like Skaven has the battle trait to have way more numbers, and then they have just the fact that rat ogres have a ton of different ways to get bonus actions. So just for doubles, they can just keep eating things, and so a rat ogre can just charge into a crowd and do that. Slanesh, like I said before, they can easily put 10 models together, and then they can get bonus actions on Slake Slash so that they're one-shot killing a lot of multiple chaff models per round. So and then Wildercore, of course, can easily ally in a Slan Starmaster, which just is an incredible chaff killer. So like that's something. And of course, they're if I'm gonna go through every faction, I may as well. So then Wildercore also have the reaction to get a bonus disengage that can keep them away from opposing elites and keep elites at arm's reach, right? So all 6 of these S tier warbands, I think, have incredible tools against both elite and swarm warbands, which is really why I put them here at the top here at S tier. However, that doesn't mean they don't have counters. And some of these have quite a few counters. And most of the warbands that counter some or all, well, there's no warband that counters all of them, in my opinion, but a lot of the warbands that counter some of these are essentially what I've put in these 2 B tiers. I think that there's quite a few just really good factions out there. And even though I just spent a ton of time praising the S tier and the A tier as well, I just think that the difference between the top lists and the good factions that are not at the top is a lot lower than it has been in previous iterations of Warcry, and that makes me really happy. I think we should all just be super thankful for that. I know that the win rates I just showed were kind of counter to that theory, but I really think that the issue there is kind of a community misunderstanding of what competitive warbands look like, which is something I'm going to try to help assuage in this video, and I'll put more videos out in the near future kind of talking about that. But when I look at the B tiers, the thing that I think impresses me the most, and what has been impressing me a lot since the most recent FAQ, is the Stormcast battle trait. I knew it was good when I read it, but I actually didn't realize how good it was until I played a couple games with Reclusians, which for whatever reason didn't make it onto this tier list. So here's the correct list with the newer factions, and I think that the new Reclusian Chamber is incredible, and while playing it, I was really blown away at how good the Stormcast battle trait really is in practice, because you can just drop down anywhere you want on the board. It just completely breaks the sort of deployment rules of the game and allows you to just like really just screw up everything, which is really funny. I think, the reason you're not necessarily hearing about it that much is the more spiky players tend to avoid Stormcast because they tend not to feel like they necessarily have the most agency, not running very many bodies. But I gotta tell you, you've got to try it because the battle trait is insane. Now, I don't think that their lack of chaff, things like that, can make it so that it's harder to put really busted lists together. And even the Reclusian Chamber, who do have chaff, they only have the 160 point regular Stormcast fighter, so just like not everything tessellates correctly into a list. But if you can find the right way to make pieces fit together, that battle trait is insane, and you will just be able to blow things up, right? You can just walk anywhere you want. You can be on any objective you want. Well, you come off on objectives, but you can be anywhere you want. You can threaten any objective you want. You can really easily hit whatever you want because you can either rush, or there's some fighters who can do it on a normal move attack and then get an onslaught in. There's a really cool Reclusian double that lets you get +1 move and +2 or 3 to your strength, and that lets you just move up and then know that you're hitting on 3s, and you do 3 damage on regular hits. It's really incredible the ways that you can break the game with Stormcast. So I really think that the 3 good Stormcast factions that actually do stuff, I think that they are all right here at the top of B, and are just really just waiting for someone to figure out the exact configuration that is broken with them, because I think they're really good. After that, I can't go through every faction here, but I do think everything here in these Bs has really powerful options. And some of them notably do kind of soft counter some of the top factions. So for example, I think Dark Oath is an absolute nightmare to face as Skaven. And I just spent a whole bunch of time calling Skaven the best faction in the game. But Dark Oath have just their oath mechanic. When they get kills, if any of their heroes get kills, they just get wild, crazy abilities. And against a lot of factions, that's not that good, right? Like against Dispossessed, I don't think Dark Oath do anything against Dispossessed. I don't think a single one of their fighters does a single bit of anything against Dispossessed. Against like Cruel Boy's Monster Killers, I think you're in a lot of trouble with Dark Oath. There's a whole bunch of factions that I don't think I'd want to run Dark Oath against at all. Like Reclusian Chamber would be fine, but the 2 other Stormcast good factions, you cannot run Dark Oath against those. But you hard counter a few things. Like if someone's brought a ton of Noblars in their Ogre Maw tribes list, Dark Oath is in a really good place. And so that's really busted, but I don't know if it's possible to make a Dark Oath warband that necessarily takes on all comers yet, and I still need to see that proven, but it's possible. It might be there. The new Wilder Fiend is absolutely insane. I don't think you should leave home without it. It's so powerful. I know a lot of people are really into the Horse Girl in Dark Oath. I'm a little more skeptical there. I think uh, she kind of exacerbates your problem of if you don't run into something that you absolutely dumpster just by being Dark Oath, then she can struggle. But she can single-handedly win certain games, so she's a very like feast or famine fighter. Dark Oath has a lot of that. That's kind of what their oath mechanic is. And so I think the key to Dark Oath right now, I think a lot of people are building Dark Oath to maximize the oath mechanic, and that's okay. You can definitely win a lot of games that way. But if you want to make like the meta defining Dark Oath list, it's not going to be about doing that. It's going to be about mitigating, figuring out the games where it's not easy to score oaths, and figuring out how you're going to win those games, and that's going to be the key there. Another faction here that is really interesting to me is Vulcan Flameseekers, because they are the most popular faction in the game. There is some issues, like for example, scale breakers are a little bit worse than they used to be in the world of lots of divine blessings, because it's a lot easier to count to 12 now than it used to be. I used to really love Jade Obelisk and Lumineth for the same reason that I like Vulcan Flameseekers, where Desecrators do a ton of damage. Stone Guard do a ton of damage. Those are still really good, but against the very top factions, when they're running sort of blessed up fighters, you can just kind of end up losing a lot of your sort of quote unquote chaff for no value, but your chaff pays an extra premium to be high damage chaff, and that can just put you in a tough spot when you just get like smushed. I showed on the list of popular allies, Varanguards are still popular, and Varanguards are the ultimate counters to 12. And so that can just be kind of a tough spot to be in. Soulblight Gravelords is here in this top tier, even though their win rate is all the way down at 46%. You've got a little bit of that here. Like, for example, Jade Obelisk is in B-, even though the win rate is down at 28%, because that super low win rate is because a couple tournament organizers in Britain have just been using Jade Obelisk as their staff bot. And so it's been kind of tanking the JO win rate, but like that's not reflective of the faction as a whole. But Soulblight, like I said before with Exile Dead, I think that if you spam Underworlds, you can get a lot done with Soulblight Gravelords, but otherwise, you are in trouble if you just play the normal compendium fighters from that faction. Ironjaws and Nighthaunt are really interesting here, sort of still in this B plus tier. Ironjaws still have the best abilities in the game. They have incredible elites. They are very good at playing above their numbers, because they can do a little bit of damage. They can get free actions on a double. So if a mega boss kills a chaff model, it can then spend a double to catch up to another chaff model and kill it, which is really nice. You can do little things like that. They have you Messin to still play in the objective game. They have all those incredible abilities. They have Shield Bash, which I wish wasn't on a triple. I really wish it was on a double. I think it's really good, but the really good movement abilities, like forcing opponent to move abilities that are really crazy that people love, are on doubles instead of triples, so that's a little tough. But the Ardboy the new Ardboy is like, if you took the old Ardboys, let's take the big Choppa Ardboy, which is 3-4-2-4. The new ones have the same attack profile, but they pay 20 points for +1 toughness and for the ability. And you just didn't see people adding +1 toughness to their big Choppa Ardboys, right? No one was happy to do that before. So it is a bit of a tough thing, but because you still have like all the tools in the world, it's still a really good warband that is going to be tough for a lot of people to play against. A lot of people don't know how to play without waiting. Personally, like I've been playing a lot of KO recently and really enjoying it. I was able to come in second in TTS League for September with KO out of like 20 something players. And I actually don't wait at all if I can avoid it with KO, because you're so slow. You want to be covering as much ground as you can. You don't have bonus actions. You're like just hoping to have enough bodies to have actions. You're not sort of doing weights and then converting them with dice. You're not turning dice into weight actions. And so you're really trying to like bury your opponent in just overall output. Actually, even though you're a swarm faction, you don't necessarily play like one. And so I was able to get a win and a draw against Iron Jaws. And even in the draw, it was an interesting thing where they beat me with movement tricks and abilities early on, and then I was actually able to catch up by almost tabling them, because KO with the right allies are just so killy, even though they don't seem it because none of their fighters do any killing. Um, so I think more people need to learn how to play against Iron Jaws, but it is a really interesting faction going forward, and I think there's still juice there. Night Haunt is fascinating because there's a bunch of Night Haunt players in my local community, which is awesome. And from what I've seen so far, watching them in action, playing against them, is that they just absolutely, when sort of built right, they just absolutely rip apart anything that is a bespoke warband or looks like a bespoke warband. So, for example, when I talked about how a lot of these B plus factions will have an S tier thing that they counter, I would never want to play Wildercore against Night Haunt. It sounds like an absolute miserable time. I think Night Haunt would just like get right into them and start murdering them right away. They'd kill your leader. They'd kill your arbalest if you had one. They'd kill the little crossbows. I think your only hope as Wildercore would be either your ally kind of soft counters Night Haunt, or like hopefully you're able with your, like, maybe the Night Haunt player tries to be KG by using chain rasps first, and then you can just shoot some of the chain rasps off the board, so that then when they kill your stuff, you're still, you're trying to build something off a house of cards here, essentially, right? So Night Haunt is interesting that way, but I don't have them higher because I don't know how you ever beat like a good destruction list with Night Haunt. I'm not sure how it can be done. Something like Skaven with all their Rat Ogres seems like a terrible thing to have to face with you. Some of the good Stormcast lists, like one of the things that Night Haunt really hangs their hat on is how hard it is to catch them. But Stormcast can really easily now just drop one fighter in that can one shot kill two really important Night Haunt fighters, and you can just plop into the little spot where you hit either one, and now it doesn't matter who wins initiative. It's a real Night Haunt, or a real nightmare for Night Haunt. So I think there's like really extreme matchup dependencies, but man, if you know that your like local metagame is very bespoke forward, choose Night Haunt. I think they're incredible into like a heavy bespoke meta. I think that's like a perfect spot for them. Some of the B minus factions are things where I still think there's really good stuff you can do, but it's just like limited. It's tough. Things like I already talked about, Lumineth, Nurgle. They just kind of play the same game they used to, except with two fewer bodies, which is just really tough. But you can still do stuff with them. They still have a really good reaction. They still have kind of a solid set of leaders in terms of that 130 point wizard, not Sloppity, but the shooty wizard, who is really good in Nurgle Demons. They've got some like reasonable options, but they just kind of play the same old game that used to be broken but isn't when you have two fewer plague bearers. Order of Azir is really interesting. Quiet Pock is still solid, but nobody plays the kinds of things he's good against, and that might change. He might get better soon as more people start bringing swarms and Quiet Pock can shoot more things, but he's going to have to kind of wait his turn on that. Shout out in the comments if there are any factions here that you wish I had kind of explained in greater depth. I put a video out on Scions of the Flame recently. Maybe it's because I have a soft spot for them that I've put them up here, but basically what they do, they just have that 3-inch reach chaff that is really, really, really good at standing behind good allies. Scions, when Scions win, they don't win because they won. They win because their allies won and they empowered their allies. Maybe that should put them in B minus tier, but I have a soft spot for them, so I've put them in B plus anyway. Let's get to the lowest tiers, and there's a few factions here that I think are worth talking about, and some things that are just more like trend lines, right? One of the factions is Iron Golems. I've been actually shocked at the Iron Golems win rate. recently. Hopefully I'll remember to put it on screen. It's very low, and a lot of folks I think have a lot of respect for iron golems because some of their profiles are good. People talk about how like iron golems have a big titan scary fighter in faction, which is really strong. But one issue with iron golems is that they have some of the worst abilities in the game, and it gets a lot better with the battle trait, but even then it gets like acceptable and it's still not good. And then when you have the battle trait, you have no allies, and everything in iron golems is just kind of correctly costed for its points, and then you don't have abilities. So, for example, the Drill Master is kind of an interesting fighter. She's got the range 3, she's got like the horde clearing ability that doesn't actually clear hordes. She's got the 18 wounds and move 5, which I think is what's actually good about her. Um, but at 140 points, that's just like the correct cost for a model like that. Nothing wrong with it, right? This is my C tier is fun factions that play Warcry, and I do think they are fun, right? But for competitive play, that's a little bit of a tough spot to be in. The Ogre Breacher, again, like at that points cost, it is perfectly reasonable, but it's not like, oh my god, undercosted. And for the lack of abilities that iron golems have, you need something that's, oh my god, undercosted. Another one here that has dropped like a stone is Horns of Hashut. Horns of Hashut took a 5-point nerf to their chaff. Their chaff is still decent, even though it doesn't have a reaction. And then they also took a huge nerf to their flamethrower. So not only are people not playing the types of swarm warbands that Horns of Hashut can survive against, but they also, I don't think they even work as an anti-horde warband anymore because the flamethrowers cost so damn much. So I think Horns of Hashut are just in an awful spot. Overall here, I think you're going to see a lot of elf factions. Elf, like, move 5 profiles in general are just really bad these days. For example, vampires are generally pretty bad other than Underworlds, and so like Askirgan Trueblades are really hurting. And so the other thing, other than elves, is defensive elites are in a really tough spot. So things like Nurgle Rotbringers have a lot of defensive elites where you need your elites. You start off down on points, right, when you have a small warband, and so you need to kill stuff to catch up. And so elites that play defense, it's just really hard for them to be relevant right now if they play defense and they don't play offense. There's also just a lot of very mid-rangey warbands that don't necessarily have chaff, or even ones that do, like for example, Fire Slayers are here. Fire Slayers, I think, might just be a worse version of Dispossessed and KO right now. I don't think they really do anything unique that is good, even though you could make a pretty good Fire Slayers warband with just starting with 10 Volkites. I think you would win a lot of games that way. You've got this 13 model warband that's going to win games, even though I think it might just be a worse version of other warbands, right? So maybe they should be in B- tier for that type of build, but I have a tough time putting them there, let's be honest. Another thing that you see a lot of in these lower tiers are new warbands, which is too bad. I really want to make a separate video about this because I really wish that I have some issues with how Games Workshop has been designing their bespoke warbands lately. I used to really bristle when people would say bespokes are way worse than compendium teams because I really just didn't think that was true for a lot of the early 2.0 bespokes and some of the late so 1.0 ones, where a lot of the time, like, there would always be one of the most broken things in the game would be a bespoke warband. And the last few have just been so bad, and it's so scary to me about, like, I like worry about the future of the game. Let's put this in a different video because I can be a lot more positive and interesting about it than I was in those last few sentences. So that's everything for the tiers. Again, if there's any one faction that you want to hear more about, shout me out in the comments. I will be happy to just give 2 sentences of thoughts on it. One parting shot I want to make, I put out a little PSA on Divine Blessings, and I think people maybe overreacted to it just a little bit. Divine Blessings, for anyone who didn't watch that video, here's a list of some fighters from 180 points to 335 points that can just put out a lot of damage at, like, compared to their threat range. And can invalidate certain fighters. And so when you look at some of these lower tiers, a lot of the factions that are in these lower tiers are here because they have a lot of fighters whose main job, honestly, is to just get killed by something that has divine blessing. That is kind of a tough spot to be in, but you can beat them. There's a lot of things you can do here. One is just be smart about how you position. Whatever your opponent is doing, when you rock up to an event, just ask, hey, what are your two scariest fighters? Take a look. It's in a book. And figure out the reading rainbow of your opponent's board, right? So ask, what is the threat range of your two scariest fighters? What is, what is the tricks that, like, what is the main ability that they do? Don't ask for every ability, because everyone has too many abilities now. It's annoying, right? You'll never finish your pregame conversation if you ask for every ability. But just ask, like, what is the thing it can do to buff up its damage or something like that, right? And just play Aura Warcry, where you just give your opponent a bit of a wide berth until you figured out how you want to attack this mission. Don't just kind of march right up forward into your opponent's threat range, because they will punish you so hard. And so just like keep your opponent kind of at arm's distance until you know how you want to attack them, until you force them to kind of change up their castle a little bit, right? They'll have to move some fighters, things like that. And that's just going to help you when you play to avoid getting totally blown out by these sort of big, scary fighters. The other things, there's a few things you can do. Off Meta Musings just put out a video with him and Wargames on Toast, where they talked about a few things that they think beat this kind of divine blessing meta. I do think that nets and chaff are quite good. You just have to make sure that if you're working on nets, you have to make sure that just because you have nets doesn't mean that you are going to just get killed somewhere else. So for example, if you have a netter and you miss your net, do you lose on the spot? That's worth asking yourself, right? If you have a bunch of nets and you net one thing and they have multiple really killy threats and you net one of them, can their other killy threats still just hit you so hard that you lose on the spot? So for example, I really think right now that the Unmade are pretty good. They're really fun. They do a lot of cool stuff, but they're one of those situations where every fighter in Unmade has a net, and that's really cool. But you could net something and just have their other threat just come kill like something very valuable, and then it wasn't really worth it for you with that net. So that can be a spot that you can get yourself in if you don't just like bring really good allies that can hold the fort a little bit. The other thing that I think is really good that I don't think that people necessarily play enough of is, yes, chaff can be good against high damage things because like swarms supposedly counter them. I think that's incredibly mission dependent. But having 2 or 3 more chaff than your opponent, and what I call reprisal. And what reprisal is let's say your opponent is going to scream in with a gut lord and you're terrified of it, right? But you have something that can take a hit from a gut lord and then potentially kill that gut lord on the on the crackback. So for example, the gut lord versus maybe like Ogroid Myrmidon is a really interesting dynamic, right? Or the Ogroid Myrmidon is scary enough that a Gutlord screaming into it won't kill it in one hit, and then the Myrmidon can still do so much damage that whoever wins initiative next round wins regardless of the fact that the Gutlord does put out more damage than the Myrmidon does. So you can give yourself killy threats that aren't as killy. The Myrmidon only being 15 points less than the Gutlord isn't necessarily the best example there, but if you have killy threats that aren't as killy but are still good enough that you won't die in one hit, and you have 2 or 3 more chaff models than your opponent, you can take a hit and then hit them back and still kill them. And that will make it so that just based on how like based on how being cagey works in Warcry, where, if you wait a few times, if you have more chaff than your opponent, you have more activations, you can get into the position you want. You can create situations where your less scary threat is actually an existential threat to your opponent's really terrifying threat, as long as you are out activating them. And so you just kind of have these almost bodyguard. So you have a high damage but not as high damage bodyguard that can sort of protect your chaff and threaten to kill an opponent's really scary thing. That can be incredibly effective. That has worked extremely well for me in Tierlist Overlords. I've gotten a ton of wins against destruction with KO doing that, but you can still sometimes get pulled apart by like the wrong initiative or by the wrong build of KO. So, for example, I was running a Calthea Zandire build at a tournament that was just kind of a fun, silly tournament, but I did it with a kind of build where I found out that anytime my one Stormcast ally, who was a Decimator Prime, didn't start on the board round one, I really couldn't do the thing that I had just talked about with Reprisal, because I just had Calthea instead of another scary thing. And she just wasn't scary enough to actually hold her own in those fights, right? So you do need to build your warband right to do it, but you can do this. And so when I came in second in TTS, it was with 10 models worth of little dwarves that were giving me activations, and then some slightly less scary fighters who were still scary enough to pose a threat. And so that can be kind of a little tightrope you can walk to have enough bodies to, if people decide to react to this meta with huge 13, 14, 15 model swarms, having 10 bodies and several attacking threats is a really nice way to counter a 14, 15 model swarm while still giving you some play against the really, really like huge destruction scary monsters. And so that can be just a place to go. So I just wanted to give people tools, because I know that video, I think, scared people a little bit more than I meant it to. And so I just want you to know that, you can do stuff against the really terrifying fighters in the game. So that's everything I have to say about the meta for Warcry right now in, this year of our Lord 2024. I'll just leave it with the parfait on the screen right now. I hope you have a ton of fun. I know that it seems like there's a lot of crazy stuff out there, but there's a lot you can do as long as you educate yourself about like how the game. There's a difference in every competitive game between every 1v1 game, not even competitive ones. There's a difference in every game between how the game is played and how the game is really played. And so if you can learn a little bit about how the game is really played, I think you can have a ton of fun here with a ton of different really fun warbands. So that's all I've got, and may all your rolls be crits.